in the remote stretches of Wilkinson County, Mississippi, where the Homachito River wound through endless acres of cotton and the nearest neighbor lived 5 miles away down roads that turned to impassable mud with every rain. There exists a story that plantation society tried desperately to erase from every record, every family Bible, every memory that might preserve it for future generations. The Thornton plantation, with its modest 2-story house and 600 acres worked by 37 enslaved people, was isolated enough that secrets could be kept for years, that arrangements considered unthinkable elsewhere could exist behind closed doors and drawn curtains. In the suffocating summer of 1856, when James Thornton died suddenly at age 43 from what the local doctor described as an apoplexy, leaving his 28-year-old widow Margaret alone with no children and a property she had no idea how to manage, something began that would violate every social boundary, every racial hierarchy, every moral code that antebellum Southern society held sacred. What the neighboring planters who occasionally visited the Thornton property didn't know was that Margaret had not remained alone in her grief, that she had found comfort in the most forbidden place imaginable, with a man who was simultaneously her late husband's half-brother and her legal property, a man whose very existence represented the dirty secret at the heart of the Thornton family legacy. This is the story of Margaret Thornton and Samuel, a widow and a slave bound by blood ties that neither chose and emotional attachments that defied every law of God and man, who created a family that couldn't be acknowledged, children who existed in a legal limbo, and a scandal that 3 generations worked to bury beneath lies, forgeries, and carefully maintained silence. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from, and if this is your first time on our channel, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that official history preferred to forget. The Thornton family had established their Mississippi plantation in 1798, when William Thornton, James's grandfather, had migrated from Virginia with 12 enslaved people, and dreams of building a cotton empire in the newly opened territories of the Deep South. The property he acquired along the Homachito River was fertile but remote, far enough from Natchez and other established communities that the family developed a reputation for reclusiveness that would serve them well in hiding their secrets. William Thornton had built a modest success, expanding his holdings to 600 acres and increasing his enslaved population to nearly 40 people by the time of his death in 1825. His son Robert inherited the property and continued its operation with the methodical efficiency that characterized successful planters of the era. Known for keeping detailed records of every bale of cotton produced, every dollar spent, every transaction involving his human property, what those records didn't show, what no official documentation ever acknowledged, was that Robert Thornton had fathered a child with an enslaved woman named Dinah in 1828. This was not uncommon in plantation society. Sexual relationships between white men and enslaved women were an open secret throughout the South, though rarely discussed in polite company. What made this situation unusual was that Robert Thornton chose to keep this child, a boy named Samuel, on the property rather than selling him away, as many plantation owners did with the mixed-race offspring of such relationships. Samuel grew up working in the plantation's carpentry shop, learning the trade from an elderly enslaved craftsman named Marcus, developing skills that made him valuable to the property's operations. He was lighter-skinned than the other enslaved people, his features showing clear evidence of mixed ancestry. But this was never openly acknowledged by Robert Thornton or anyone else in the white family. Samuel knew who his father was. Dinah had told him when he was old enough to understand, but he also understood that this knowledge must never be spoken aloud, that the fiction of being just another enslaved worker on the property was essential to his survival and his mother's safety. Robert Thornton's legitimate son James, born in 1813 to Robert's wife Catherine, grew up alongside Samuel, though the nature of their relationship was complicated by the unacknowledged fact that they were half-brothers. James, 15 years older than Samuel, had been educated at a boarding school in Natchez and had spent several years working in his father's cotton brokerage business before returning to take over management of the plantation in 1840. He married Margaret Hayes in 1845, a marriage arranged by their respective families, uniting two modest plantation properties and providing James with a wife who brought a small dowry of 804 enslaved people as her contribution to the household. Margaret Hayes Thornton was 17 years old when she married, the daughter of a struggling planter from neighboring Adams County who saw this marriage as securing his daughter's future in uncertain economic times. She was educated enough to read and write, had been trained in the domestic arts expected of a plantation mistress, and had been taught that her role was to manage the household, produce children, and maintain the social respectability that was essential to her husband's standing in the community. She took to her role with dutiful competence, if not enthusiasm, managing the house servants, overseeing food preparation and preservation, maintaining the social connections with neighboring families that plantation life required. What she didn't know until years into her marriage was that the enslaved carpenter Samuel, whom she occasionally saw working on repairs around the property, was her husband's half-brother, that James had known this his entire adult life, and that this secret connection would eventually reshape her entire existence. James Thornton ran the plantation with the same methodical approach his father had used, keeping detailed ledgers, maintaining equipment and buildings in good repair, treating his enslaved workers with what he considered appropriate severity, tempered by occasional small kindnesses. He was neither the cruelest nor the most lenient of plantation owners, simply a man who saw enslaved people as valuable property that required proper management to maintain productivity. His relationship with Samuel was complicated by the unacknowledged blood tie between them. James never spoke to Samuel about their shared parentage, never acknowledged their relationship in any way. But he also never sold Samuel or assigned him to the brutal field work that destroyed so many enslaved people's health. Samuel remained in the carpentry shop, his skills increasing over the years, his value to the plantation growing as he became capable of handling increasingly complex building and repair projects. The marriage between James and Margaret was childless, a source of increasing anxiety, as the years passed without the heir that was expected to continue the family line. By 1855, after 10 years of marriage, it had become clear that no children would be forthcoming, a situation that weighed heavily on both of them for different reasons. James worried about who would inherit the property, about the family line ending with his generation, about the social stigma attached to a childless marriage. Margaret worried that her failure to produce children made her a disappointment, that her value as a wife was diminished, that her position in the household was less secure without children to bind her to the family. Neither of them spoke directly about this situation, but it hung over their marriage like a constant shadow, a failure that couldn't be remedied but couldn't be forgotten. In the spring of 1856, James Thornton's health began to decline rapidly. He suffered from severe headaches, periods of confusion and slurred speech, moments of weakness in his left arm and leg. The local doctor, called to examine him in April, diagnosed apoplexy, what modern medicine would recognize as a series of strokes, and warned that James's condition was serious and likely to worsen. James spent the last 2 months of his life largely confined to his bedroom, cared for by Margaret and 2 enslaved house servants, his mental faculties declining as his physical condition deteriorated. He died on June 23, 1856, with Margaret at his bedside, his last words unintelligible, his final moments peaceful as he simply stopped breathing. Margaret Thornton, suddenly widowed at 28 years old, found herself in a precarious position. She inherited the plantation under the terms of James's will, But she had no experience managing agricultural operations, no real understanding of the cotton market, and no male relatives nearby who could assist her. The overseer who had managed the field operations under James's direction was competent enough, but expected to deal with a male property owner, clearly uncomfortable taking instructions from a woman. Neighboring planters who had socialized with James and Margaret offered their condolences and their assistance, but their help came with expectations of eventual remarriage. Suggestions that Margaret should consider uniting her property with that of an established planter through a new marriage. Implications that a woman alone couldn't possibly manage a plantation long-term. Margaret resented these implications even as she recognized their practical basis, and she determined to prove that she could manage the property herself, at least for a time, before making any decisions about her future. It was during this period of adjustment, in the months immediately following James's death, that Margaret's relationship with Samuel began to shift from the formal distance appropriate between mistress and enslaved worker to something far more complicated and forbidden. Samuel had been assigned to make repairs to the main house, fixing a section of the front porch that had begun to rot, replacing several window frames that had warped in the damp climate, tasks that brought him into regular contact with Margaret as she supervised the work. Their conversations during these interactions began to extend beyond the immediate tasks at hand. Margaret asking Samuel's opinion about other repairs that might be needed, Samuel offering observations about the property's maintenance that revealed his deep familiarity with every structure on the land. Margaret found herself drawn to these conversations, finding in Samuel an intelligence and insight that surprised her, qualities she had never noticed when James was alive, because she had never really looked at Samuel as anything other than another enslaved worker. What Margaret didn't know initially was the true nature of Samuel's relationship to her late husband, though she had begun to notice the resemblance between Samuel's features and James's, a similarity that seemed more than coincidental. It was Sarah, one of the elderly house servants who had been on the property for over 40 years, who finally revealed the truth to Margaret during a conversation in late August. Sarah, who had known both James and Samuel their entire lives, who had watched this unacknowledged brotherhood play out over decades, apparently decided that Margaret deserved to know the truth about the man she had been married to, and the man she had been growing increasingly close to, the revelation that Samuel was James's half-brother, that Robert Thornton had fathered Samuel with an enslaved woman, that this secret had been maintained for nearly 3 decades, shocked Margaret profoundly. She struggled to process the implications of this information, the realization that her late husband had owned his own half-brother as property, that the Thornton family had built their respectability on a foundation of hidden transgressions, that Samuel himself had lived his entire life knowing his true parentage but unable ever to acknowledge it. The knowledge of Samuel's true identity should have made Margaret more cautious about her growing emotional attachment to him, should have reinforced the absolute necessity of maintaining proper boundaries between mistress and enslaved property. Instead, it had the opposite effect. Margaret found herself seeing Samuel in a new light, not as a slave, but as a person who had been denied his rightful place in the family, as someone who had been treated unjustly by the very system that Margaret herself benefited from, as a man who shared her late husband's blood but had been condemned to a life of servitude because of the circumstances of his birth. This realization awakened in Margaret something she had never felt before, a sense of the fundamental injustice of slavery, a recognition that the neat categories of white and black, free and enslaved, master and property, were maintained through deliberate choices to ignore obvious truths. Her growing feelings for Samuel, which she had been trying to dismiss as simple loneliness and grief, became mixed with a sense of moral obligation, a desire to somehow make amends for the terrible wrong that had been done to him. By October 1856, 4 months after James's death, Margaret and Samuel had become intimate. The exact circumstances of how this line was crossed are not recorded, but the consequences would become apparent soon enough. Their relationship existed in absolute secrecy, conducted only within the confines of the main house after the other servants had retired for the night, never acknowledged in daylight, never discussed with anyone. Margaret was acutely aware of how completely this relationship violated every social norm, how it would destroy her reputation and likely result in violence against Samuel if it were discovered. Samuel, for his part, was caught in an impossible situation, unable to refuse the advances of a woman who owned him legally, aware that this relationship could result in his death if discovered, but also apparently genuinely attached to Margaret in ways that transcended the power dynamics that defined their social positions. For the next decade, from 1856 to 1866, Margaret Thornton and Samuel lived in an arrangement that would have been unthinkable if it had been publicly known. Margaret continued to manage the plantation with Samuel's increasingly open assistance, with him gradually taking over more of the decision-making about repairs, equipment, and property maintenance. To neighboring planters who occasionally visited, Samuel was simply an especially skilled and trusted slave whom the widow relied upon for practical matters. What they didn't see were the nights when Samuel entered the main house through a back entrance, when he shared Margaret's bed and her life in ways that completely inverted the expected hierarchy of plantation society. Between 1857 and 1865, Margaret gave birth to 4 children. The official records listed these children as orphans that Margaret had taken in out of charity, displaced children from families devastated by economic hardship and eventually by the Civil War. But the truth, obvious to anyone who looked at these children's features, was that they were Margaret's biological children, and their father was Samuel. The first child, a boy born in November 1857, was named James after Margaret's late husband, a choice that revealed either Margaret's continuing grief or perhaps a deliberate attempt to create a fiction that this child was somehow connected to the legitimate Thornton line. The second child, a girl born in 1859, was named Catherine after James's mother. 2 more children followed, another boy in 1862 and a girl in 1865, both given names from the Thornton family tree, as if Margaret was determined to assert these children's rightful place in a family that would never acknowledge them. The children's legal status was complicated and precarious. They were clearly mixed race, their features showing obvious evidence of both African and European ancestry, which, under Mississippi law of the time, meant they should have been classified as Negro, and therefore subject to enslavement. But Margaret registered them as white in what few records she was forced to create, claimed them as her wards, and raised them in the main house rather than the slave quarters. A situation that would have caused scandal if the family had not been so isolated, and if Margaret had not been so successful in keeping neighbors at a distance. The Civil War, which reached Mississippi in earnest by 1863, actually provided cover for this unusual domestic arrangement, as social disruption and the breakdown of normal plantation oversight meant that irregular situations could exist without the scrutiny they might have received in more settled times. Samuel's position during these years was deeply contradictory. He was legally enslaved until the end of the Civil War in 1865, meaning that for the first 8 years of his relationship with Margaret and the early childhood of his 4 children, he was simultaneously their father and Margaret's legal property. He could not legally marry Margaret, could not claim his children, could not protect them from being taken or sold if Margaret chose to do so, or if some legal proceeding resulted in the property being seized. Yet within the confines of the Thornton plantation, he functioned essentially as the head of household, making decisions about property management, directing the work of other enslaved people, even disciplining the children when necessary. This inversion of expected roles was maintained only through absolute secrecy and the cooperation of the other enslaved people on the property, who apparently chose not to reveal what they certainly knew about the relationship between Margaret and Samuel. The end of the Civil War and the emancipation of enslaved people in 1865 should have resolved some of these contradictions, allowing Samuel to claim his freedom and potentially legitimize his relationship with Margaret. Instead, it created new complications. Mississippi and other southern states passed black codes in 1865 and 1866 that severely restricted the rights of formerly enslaved people, including laws that prohibited interracial marriage, laws that made it illegal for black people to own certain types of property, and vagrancy laws that could be used to force formerly enslaved people back into labor arrangements that closely resembled slavery. Samuel's decision to remain on the Thornton plantation after emancipation, working now theoretically as a paid employee rather than enslaved property, continued the existing arrangement while adding new legal dangers. If the true nature of his relationship with Margaret were discovered, both could face legal prosecution under the anti-miscegenation laws, and the children's status would become even more precarious. Through the late 1860s and into the 1870s, Margaret and Samuel maintained their secret arrangement with increasing difficulty. The children were growing older, their mixed-race ancestry becoming more apparent, their presence in the main house requiring increasingly elaborate explanations. Margaret claimed they were the children of a cousin who had died during the war, a story that became harder to maintain as the children grew, and their features clearly showed their true parentage. Neighboring planters, struggling with their own post-war adjustments, seemed willing to overlook Margaret's irregular household as long as she maintained basic proprieties and didn't openly flaunt the situation. But there were limits to what isolation and willful blindness could protect, and by 1873, when the eldest child, James, was approaching 16 years old, it had become clear that the fiction could not be maintained indefinitely. The resolution of this situation came not through any dramatic revelation or scandal, but through a series of quiet arrangements and financial transactions that revealed how carefully Margaret had been planning for this moment. In 1873, Margaret sold the Thornton plantation to a buyer from Natchez, claiming that she was too old and tired to continue managing the property, that she wished to retire to a small house in town and live out her remaining years in peace. What the public record didn't show was that a significant portion of the proceeds from this sale went to purchasing a small farm in southern Illinois, a property that was registered in the name of Samuel Thornton, using a surname that he had no legal right to, but that Margaret insisted he claim as his own. Margaret herself moved to a modest house in Natchez, where she lived as a respectable widow, attending church and engaging in the limited social activities appropriate for a woman of her age and economic means. But multiple documents discovered in county records decades later revealed that Margaret made regular trips to Illinois, ostensibly to visit relatives, but actually to see Samuel and their children, who were living as a family under the fiction that Samuel was a widowed farmer raising children from a previous marriage. This arrangement continued until Margaret's death in 1889 at age 61. Her will, a document that caused considerable confusion when it was read, left substantial sums to 4 individuals identified only by first names and described as children of a late cousin, instructions that her executor eventually interpreted as referring to the 4 mixed-race children who had been raised in her household. Samuel, now in his 60s, continued farming in Illinois for several more years before dying in 1896, having outlived Margaret by 7 years. The children that Margaret and Samuel had produced, raised in an impossible situation as the mixed-race offspring of a relationship that violated every law and social norm of their time, had varying fates in the post-war South and Midwest. The eldest boy, James, managed to pass as white in Illinois, eventually marrying a white woman and starting a family that had no knowledge of his true ancestry. The second child, Catherine, married a mixed-race man and lived in a black community in Chicago, openly acknowledging her African ancestry while maintaining silence about her mother's identity. The two youngest children both died relatively young, one from consumption in 1881 and the other in a farming accident in 1890, neither having married or produced children of their own. The truth about Margaret Thornton and Samuel's relationship only came to light decades later, when a genealogist researching the Thornton family in the 1930s discovered inconsistencies in property records, found Margaret's will with its cryptic bequests, and eventually located descendants of the eldest son, James, who still had letters that Margaret had written to their father, letters that made the nature of the relationship unmistakably clear. These letters, written in Margaret's own hand, revealed a woman who had been deeply in love with Samuel, who viewed their relationship not as a transgression, but as a kind of justice, righting the wrong that had been done to him by his father and half-brother. She wrote of the impossibility of their situation, of her frustration with laws and social customs that condemned as immoral what she believed was the truest and most honest relationship she had ever experienced, of her hope that their children would find ways to live full lives despite the circumstances of their birth. Samuel, who was barely literate, left no comparable written record, so his thoughts about the relationship and his children exist only as filtered through Margaret's letters and the few accounts provided by elderly, formerly enslaved people who were interviewed in the early 1900s about plantation life. These accounts suggested that Samuel had been well regarded by other enslaved people on the Thornton property, that he was seen as using his unique position to gain small advantages and protections for others when possible, and that his relationship with Margaret was viewed with a mixture of admiration for his daring and anxiety about the potential consequences if it were discovered. The psychological and moral complexities of Margaret and Samuel's relationship defy simple categorization. Was this a love story? Two people who found genuine connection across the vast divide of race and social position in 19th century Mississippi? Or was it an exploitation, a white woman using her power over an enslaved man to satisfy her own emotional and physical needs, regardless of the danger she placed him in? The truth likely contains elements of both, along with factors that can't be fully understood from the historical distance of over 150 years. What is undeniable is that Margaret and Samuel created a family that existed in legal limbo, that they maintained a relationship that required constant vigilance and secrecy, and that they somehow managed to keep their arrangement hidden for decades in a society that would have responded with violence if the full truth had been revealed. The four children born to Margaret and Samuel represented multiple forms of impossibility. They were the half-siblings of their own father, connected through James Thornton to both sides of their parentage. They were simultaneously heirs to the Thornton family line and completely excluded from any claim to that heritage. They were evidence of a relationship that challenged every assumption about race, power, and choice in the antebellum and post-war South. Their very existence raised questions about identity and belonging that the racial categories of the time could not adequately address. Modern historians who have studied this case debate how representative it might be of broader patterns in plantation society. Margaret and Samuel's relationship was certainly not the only instance of sexual relationships between white women and enslaved, or formerly enslaved men in the South, though such relationships were far less common than those between white men and enslaved women, and were subject to much more severe social and legal sanctions. What made this case unusual was its duration. Spanning a decade before emancipation, and continuing for years afterward. Its apparent emotional depth, suggested by Margaret's letters and her financial arrangements to provide for Samuel and their children, and its successful concealment for so long, despite the birth of 4 children whose features clearly revealed their mixed-race ancestry. The Thornton plantation property, sold in 1873, passed through several owners before being subdivided in the 1920s. The main house where Margaret and Samuel conducted their secret relationship was torn down in 1931, with no marker indicating the complex history it had contained. The slave quarters where Samuel had spent his early years disappeared even earlier, the small wooden structures rotting away within years of being abandoned. The only physical trace of this story that remains is the small cemetery where James Thornton and his parents are buried, their headstones still legible though weathered by over 150 years of Mississippi weather. Samuel's grave is in Illinois, hundreds of miles away, marked with a simple stone that identifies him by his chosen surname Thornton, a name he had no legal right to claim, but that represented his assertion of connection to the family that had both created him and denied him. If this story revealed something you never knew about the hidden relationships that existed beneath the surface of plantation society, leave a comment telling us what surprised you most. And if you want more untold stories of forbidden love, impossible choices, and the secrets that families kept for generations, subscribe. These stories matter not just as history, but as reminders that human relationships have always been more complicated than the rigid category societies try to impose. That love and exploitation can exist simultaneously in relationships defined by power imbalances, and that the past contains countless stories of people who lived lives that defied the rules of their time. They thought Margaret Thornton was simply a widow managing her late husband's plantation, perhaps with the help of trusted servants, living a respectable if somewhat isolated life in the remote stretches of Wilkinson County. But the truth was that she had built a family with a man who was both her late husband's half-brother and her legal property, had given birth to 4 children who existed in the undefined space between white and black, free and enslaved, legitimate and illegitimate, and had somehow kept this impossible arrangement hidden for long enough that when it was finally revealed, decades after her death, the people directly affected were no longer alive to face the consequences. And in the careful arrangements she made to provide for Samuel and their children, in the letters she wrote expressing her love and her frustration with the injustice of laws that condemned their relationship, Margaret Thornton left evidence of a woman who chose to violate every social norm of her time and place because she believed that what she and Samuel had created together was more real and more valuable than the respectability she was required to maintain.